I don't want to depress you, but if you're watching this around the time it's published, we have almost half a year to go before 2026 is a metaphorical train wreck in the rearview mirror of history. And there is so much that could happen between now and then that could make the hell we experienced in the first 6.5 months of this year seem like the beginner tutorial in that new hit video game your friends told you really should play. You know, the one where the gameplay is engaging, the baddies are clearly defined, and just as you think you've got a handle on the mechanics, you learn that it was just some initial scene-setting battle that's actually super easy to ace. But you don't realise that until you hit your first real battle after you've spec'd your character up. And this year, we've seen our fair share of politicians and regulators around the world try to embrace what would seem like a sensible idea on paper, only to completely wreck it in committee. Take legislation around lithium battery fires. It's a problem, especially when it comes to e-bike battery packs, and while there's a bunch of overhyped, breathless coverage of how dangerous e-bike batteries are, there have been some documented horrific cases involving people who have either been severely injured or died as a result of a poorly made e-bike, drone, or one-wheel battery pack causing a fire. Not because those batteries are inherently unsafe, but because, to this point, adherence to safety standards has been lax at best and criminally negligent at worst. And while that legislation does need a rewrite, some rules, as is the case in California, are written with simultaneously enough vagueness to encompass all battery packs, including those on DIY home builds by people who actually understand and mitigate risks, and enough rigidity to really screw things up for existing owners. It penalises the competent under the guise of safety for all. Then there are rules about ghost guns and 3D printers. And to be clear, I abhor guns. I grew up in a country with tight gun control, though many people on the farm did have guns, and I still abhor them. I think people should be allowed to have them, but only if they pass strict background and safety tests regularly. And I welcome regulation designed to keep guns out of the hands of irresponsible and dangerous folk. But many US states are now enacting or proposing new rules designed to not penalise the ownership of a ghost 3D printed gun, but penalise the equipment that is technically possible to make one on, forcing every 3D print to be screened by firearm detection software baked into the printer or slicer before it'll even run, to make sure it's not part of a gun. But it's a backdoor to clamping down on people making things on their 3D printers and CNC machines, like spare parts for things they own, and it won't stop with ghost guns. Tackle the real problem: irresponsible gun owners, not the machine you could theoretically use to make one. And then there's the whole debacle in the computer world right now. A call for software to age verify users to confirm they're not a minor about to be given unfettered access to the internet. Instead of focusing on ensuring that communities teach young people about the dangers of being online and creating a world where they have the tools and skills required to stay safe, and then ask adults for help, the onus is on the companies that make the operating systems that run on computers, smartphones, gadgets, and tablets, including Linux operating systems that don't have the massive coffers of Microsoft or Apple, thus disadvantaging them commercially and possibly making their OS distributions illegal. Do you see the pattern? Good intention, real problem, and then a fix so broad that the people who get caught in it are the end users, the tinkerers, the fixers, the makers, the very people who were never the problem to begin with. And we potentially are about to see it again in the form of a bipartisan bill that has made its way through the US legislature. A bill that on paper appeared to be exactly what we wanted it to be, a right to repair bill that would have given car owners access to the same diagnostics equipment and software used by dealerships. But in its passage from its introduction last year to where we are now, it's been gutted, modified, and impacted so heavily by auto industry lobbyists and special interest groups that it's really not what it was originally meant to be. So today, we're going to look at that very bill, the Repair Act, and the Motor Vehicle Modernisation Act it's been folded into and gutted by, and examine exactly what it will mean for those of you who, like me, do like to be able to work on your own vehicles. I know, I'm getting something of a reputation in these parts for being a bit of a policy wonk. And I don't know if it's the middle-aged talking, my predilection for digging into context, or just the fact that, other things in the last 10 years have forced me to become a whole lot more active in the political world. But yes, this is another video that touches on politics, because politics matter. But instead of this being a one-side bad, one-side good argument, this is going to be about the actual meat and potatoes of how a bill gets gutted on its way through the US Congress, and how its original intent to make it easier for car owners to fix their own vehicles has been quietly neutered by a plethora of modifications. Modifications that will affect everyone who owns a car, and more importantly for this channel, everyone who owns an electric vehicle. Because some of the rhetoric used to chip away at this bill has centred on how dangerous our electric vehicles supposedly are. They are wildly dangerous. You knew that, right? I mean, it's honestly a wonder that any of us are still driving them. Now, I could give you a full history lesson here, but that would make this video roughly the length of a feature film, and we'd never reach the actual point. So in the spirit of that video game from the top of the show, let's speedrun it. Automakers and dealers have, more than once throughout history, gotten a little too big for their britches and made it genuinely hard to get your car serviced anywhere but an approved dealership, where aftermarket parts and accessories get blamed for failures without a shred of proof, and where "you'll void your warranty" became a threat wielded far more often than was actually true. That's a whole video on its own, but if you really want to see the cutscene, there's plenty out there on the Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act of 1975 and the general good it did for owners who wanted to modify or work on their own vehicles, even if some modern automakers try to ignore its existence. But I'm going to assume that, like me, you're just spamming the A button to get through the mandatory dialogue and cut to the actual matter at hand. Right to repair in 2026. The Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act of 1975 has helped many a generation of car owners repair their own vehicles without fear of reprisal from automakers who made or dealers who sold their car. But its language is now over 50 years old, and it was written at a time when computers in cars were still a very cutting-edge thing. Today, meanwhile, we have onboard computers in every automotive system. We have telematics systems that communicate between your car and the mothership of its parent auto company. We have software-defined vehicle architecture, and everything that was once completely manual now involves a computer in some way or another. And because of how legislation has been written, governing computer software, namely the code and how it runs on a system, that generally falls under copyright rules. Section 1201 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act of 1998, if you're interested. Meaning automakers have been, shall we say, leaning heavily on copyright law to behave in an ultimately protectionist way. Automakers increasingly fall back on the notion that car companies shouldn't be forced to give customers access to the tools and equipment that allow them to work on their own vehicles, because in doing so, they open the door to the possibility that the software running on their vehicles and the hardware that runs that software could be open up to those seeking to copy, modify, or break their proprietary code. And just as a society that never changes is doomed to die, legislation that's 50 years old and hasn't kept up with the industry is increasingly toothless. And those in the industry, especially their well-paid lawyers, are figuring out ways around it. Which is where the bill we're discussing today comes in. The Federal Repair Act, H.R. 1566. It was introduced in a previous Congress as H.R. 906 and reintroduced last year. It's making its way through the House of Representatives, sponsored by Republican Representative Neil Dunn of Florida and Democrat Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez of Washington. In the Senate, its twin bill is sponsored by Democrat Ben Ray Lujan of New Mexico and Republican Josh Hawley of Missouri. Yes, I am as shocked as you that hard-right Republican Senator Josh Hawley is pro-consumer rights instead of pro-lobbyist. But I guess this just shows you that everyone is capable of good. The original bill, as submitted, would patch the hole between the Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act and today by requiring automakers to make diagnostic data, repair tools and technical information available to independent shops and owners, not just franchised dealerships. That would mean that not only would car owners who rent on their own vehicles gain more freedom to do so, but it would make it easier for everyone to pick a non-franchised garage to work on their cars. And that in of itself is super important, as it means more mom-and-pop garages working on vehicles rather than overpriced and frankly often poorly trained dealerships who would just rather sell you a new car than fix the one that you have. And yeah, I'm salty about my recent experience with an accident repair centre and insurance company. Go check out my various videos on that particular saga, linked below. As it was initially introduced, the bill would, if passed as introduced, have brought nationwide the kind of right to repair legislation that we're already seeing in a few US states. It would have undone some of the paywalled access and manufacturer-designed customer lockouts that is currently the status quo. Lockouts that, among other things, make it difficult for customers to replace parts, add new features, or carry out basic maintenance tasks. Take lights, for example. At one point, replacing a broken taillight lens on your vehicle was as simple as unbolting the broken one and fitting a new one. On some modern vehicles, let's look at my Ford F-150 Lightning, for example. There are sensors hidden within the rear light clusters that are used for driver assistance features like blind spot monitoring. Replacing the entire cluster with a new one, even a new OEM part sourced from the local dealership, will cause your truck to throw error messages, because you need specific software to carry out a factory recalibration of those sensors before your vehicle works as normal. And in the last 5 years, as more and more automakers have developed encrypted communication buses for their vehicles, that requirement to click some buttons once you've replaced a like-for-like part can lock out enthusiasts and some independent garages from carrying out maintenance. And that locks customers into an effective, closed-walled garden of sanctioned dealerships, who will quite happily charge you more because they don't face any meaningful competition. I'll talk about the original text of the bill in a second, but first, did you know that we're only here because of our amazing community of supporters? Unlike a lot of channels, we don't take big advertorial sponsorship deals, and frankly, if we did, I doubt we'd have as much freedom to make videos like this one, so instead, we rely on our amazing community of supporters on Patreon, YouTube, Discord, Fluxer, and Ko-fi, and you can become one of them from just $1.50 a month. You'll find links down below if you'd like to join and help us out. And right now, that help would be extra appreciated. My partner recently lost her job to corporate restructuring, and while she is carrying on her job search, the reality is that her salary was what covered our mortgage and bills. Now, we are in a temporary situation, and while we are working through it, more support from this community would genuinely help us to keep on keeping on, while also ensuring that the TE team can also keep their jobs and keep paying their own bills. So if you've ever thought about joining, now really is a good time, and every single contribution, however small, makes a massive difference. Thanks. Let's get back to the bill now, and then I'll cover what changed. The original text of H.R. 1566, along with its Senate sibling, was meant to end the closed-wall garden. In addition to giving independent repair shops and enthusiasts access to data, tools, and information, it mandated that automakers give direct access to telematics and wirelessly transmitted data to third parties using a standardized, non-proprietary interface. In other words, it called on automakers to stop hiding behind proprietary data communication protocols and to provide you access to your car's data through a standardized protocol and interface instead. It also required automakers to stop designing systems that inherently locked out third-party and enthusiast repair and servicing. And all of this came with a real enforcement mechanism through the FTC that would levy heavy fines against those who ignored and violated the regulations. But look, this is Transport Evolved, and you know I'm making a video on this not to say, yay, this passed and we're all able to work on our cars. Because that's not what happened. About a month ago, on May 21st, the bill was finally marked up in committee and it was substantially changed from its original content. So much so, in fact, that much of the bill was gutted and what survived got folded into a new bill, HR 7389, which recently passed the Energy and Commerce Committee. Gone are the telematics and direct wireless data access provisions, meaning third-party telematics apps are now back at the whims of the individual automakers. And by the way, if you haven't seen my recent video on Volkswagen and its API debacle, go watch that one after this. Also gone are the anti-lockout and standardized open interface provisions. And in their place, and I'm paraphrasing here, automakers basically just have to keep doing what they agreed to do back in 2014 in a memorandum of understanding that was always more of a polite handshake than a binding rule. Unfortunately, memorandums of understanding, MOUs, usually aren't worth the paper they're printed on. They're just a document acknowledging that different parties are working together to solve something, or worse still, simply acknowledging that there's a problem at all. You see them every time two companies announce a big shiny partnership, or when two government agencies agree to share data. It sounds official and important and binding, but more often than not, there's not actually anything forcing anyone to follow through, which is exactly why leaning on a decade-old one to protect your right to repair your car should bother you. Now, to be fair, that new bill does at least make the 2014 agreement enforceable, handing the Federal Trade Commission the power to levy civil penalties if automakers ignore it. But there's a catch. That 2014 framework was written for 2014 cars. It doesn't cover the telematics, the wireless data, the over-the-air everything that defines a modern software-defined connected vehicle. And rather than actually tackle that, the bill just kicks it down the road, ordering the FTC to study the issue and report back in 4 years. The revised version of the bill was so different that even Representative Dunn, and here I want to remind you, a Republican, said the new version was, quote, a watered-down version that was derailed by parties that stand to gain from the status quo, end quote, adding that it, quote, does not fully reflect the original Repair Act and fails to protect consumers, independent repair shops and aftermarket manufacturers, end quote. Who was responsible for this rewrite? Well, I will give you 3 guesses, but you only actually need one. The Alliance for Automotive Innovation and similar lobbying groups funded by deep pockets in Detroit, i.e. legacy automakers. I'll come back to that in a moment, but first, it'd be disingenuous to not cover what was in the just passed committee bill alongside the heavily gutted, now sidelined HR 1566, because most of it actually makes sense. It just happens to have stripped much of the meaningful right to repair stuff out along the way. For example, it brings about some important NHTSA reform designed to improve safety for everyone on the road. It absorbed a large part of the text of the Safe Vehicle Access for Survivors Act, specifically designed to stop domestic violence survivors from being digitally stalked through connected vehicle services. It included provisions for improved safety for cyclists and pedestrians and, mercifully for the first time, a new set of guidelines designed to ensure people better understand automated driving systems, as well as drawing a clearer line between SAE Level 3 and higher levels of autonomous driving and those below it. And believe me, as someone who's been calling for better rules on autonomous vehicles for years, I think that's genuinely a good thing. Under this new bill, NHTSA recall notices can also be delivered electronically, a boon when a customer moves house between buying a car and a recall notice being filed. And all of this served to make something of a nice, tasty sandwich of automotive and road safety goodness that was just too good to resist. Too good not to pass. But as is so often the case on Capitol Hill and in other legislative bodies around the world, the good stuff hides the bad stuff. And just as some folk have sought to slip poison pills over things like reproductive rights, immigrant safety and LGBTQIA+ protections into bills that would otherwise sail through largely unimpeded, the same is true here for right to repair. Because the bill as it sits right now, and bear in mind, I can't tell you exactly where it is in its process, because these things change and you might be watching this months after the fact because YouTube be like that. It all strips out the things we really wanted, the right to work on our own vehicles and have access to our own vehicle data. It doesn't remove rights completely, but it kneecaps things enough that if an automaker decides it doesn't want you accessing its CAN bus data, there's not a lot you can do about it. So we have a bill that was substantially changed, effectively gutted, and rolled into another bill that was too good not to pass, one that carved out some of the most important provisions for those of us with EVs who want to work on our own vehicles. And behind that push, the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, an industry lobby representing the automakers along with auto industry-aligned interests on Capitol Hill. It's well known that the auto industry has incredible persuasive power in Washington. As Open Secrets lays out, the auto industry as a whole spent nearly $86 million on federal lobbying in a single record year. And last year alone, the Alliance for Automotive Innovation spent $7.83 million bending ears in DC. It's worth noting that the effort to ban Chinese-made EVs from being sold in the US, and more recently, to bar them from even entering it, came in no small part from the auto industry and its various lobbying arms, who'd benefit rather nicely from keeping rivals they fear they can't beat out in an open marketplace. And their stated reason? Cybersecurity, a hot-button topic that attracts support on both sides of the aisle. And it was in that very vein that the Alliance for Automotive Innovation set up its opposition to the original text of HR 1566. And for the sheer hypocrisy of this, I'm going to hope you saw the recent video I did on that Volkswagen API access. I know I've mentioned it several times in this video. Lobbyists claimed the original text was dangerous and that the provisions on telematics needed to be removed for a number of reasons. Their three big complaints was first, security. By giving customers access to the telematics system, lobbyists claimed you'd open up a safety and cybersecurity risk. That third-party access to telematics would open the door to hackers who could access and even control your vehicle. That some nefarious sort would take control of your car with you behind the wheel and cause you to lose control of it. Second, they claimed it would put customers' private data at greater risk, and that it would be tougher to guarantee the security of customer data if API access was opened up to all. That if enthusiasts were given full access to a vehicle's system, it would also mean that Elliot Alderson and his cohorts would also gain access to do naughty things. Okay, I exaggerated that last bit, but you get my drift. The third one, and I have some actual experience of this recently, was the claim that the bill didn't benefit EV and ICE car owners but insurance companies. The Alliance, along with the National Automobile Dealers Association, said that the proposed rules would open up repair and service to a wider number of independent shops and repair paths, and that would let auto insurance companies steer customers away from dealer-approved repair places. And that, they argued, would benefit insurance companies because they'd be getting cheaper repair jobs and spending less on payouts, while harming automakers and dealers whose repair work tends to be more expensive. Now, some people, like me, would say more competition is exactly the point. Case in point, when my truck was damaged, the first place I took it to was a Ford dealership's own body shop. They looked it over for a few minutes and declared there was no damage. It took another 3 months before we realised it actually was damaged, at which point I asked a different Ford dealership where I should send it. The place they recommended then priced the repair way out of line with anything normal, said they couldn't buy the part after buying the wrong one, and then tried to claim my truck couldn't be repaired at all, ready to let the insurance company write it off. It wasn't until I got involved and brought in the heavies, a few contacts at Ford, that it finally got sorted. So forgive me if I'm not convinced that the approved path is the one looking out for me. It's not. So, owner access to telematics outside of official sanctioned apps? Off the table, thanks to the lobbyist. So too are the tools that would let you connect your EV yourself. The auto industry wants you to have to pay someone else to maintain and access the data about your EV, either a dealership or through a monthly fee. Oh, and they most certainly do not want Chinese-made EVs in the US. And that's not the end of it. Because a few weeks ago, President Donald Trump claimed that the auto industry, or rather senior representatives from GM, Ford's president of Ford Blue and Model E, Andrew Frick, representatives from NADA, and Roger Penske of Penske Automotive, all went to the White House to lobby for a bill that would restrict owners' rights to repair their vehicles, not open it up. Now, as with much of what the president says, the claims don't appear to be backed up, and the automakers involved have pointedly not confirmed his version of events. Though notably, they haven't denied them either. Ford, for its part, did confirm that Frick was there, and that repair practices were discussed, but wouldn't actually say what was argued. Nobody else, when questioned, confirmed who was there or what was said. But President Donald Trump did make some strange claims about that meeting. First, he said that automakers don't want people to fix their own cars, which he himself called strange. And second, and I want to be clear, we've not been able to substantiate this, he said that someone was given a prison sentence for working on their own car, which, let's face it, seems preposterous, and despite looking, I have found zero evidence to back that up. And what more can I say? We know the US president likes to embellish things, so take from that what you will. Nothing here, or at least nothing we can substantiate, seems to point to a future where you can't work on your own car. But then, Ford CEO Jim Farley was questioned by the Detroit Free Press about that meeting, and what he said was rather more concerning. He told the publication that Ford was a big advocate for the ability to repair a vehicle, but that it, quote, has to be done at a reasonable cost, end quote. He then went on, when asked whether Ford didn't want people working on their own vehicles, to say, quote, no, that's fine, not for warranty work. Later, he added that while classic cars were perfectly fine to work on, modern vehicles need all kinds of specialty tools, implying that an untrained owner working on their own vehicle could leave it in an unsafe state, or at least fail to properly understand the safety protocols and repair procedures needed to get a vehicle, like an EV, safely back on the road. And that's a bad look for a company that, at least in its pickup truck world, has actively encouraged people to wrench on their own vehicles. It's a bad look for a company that seemingly delights in its owners customizing their EVs. And it's a bad look for the auto industry in general, especially at an age where the average vehicle on US roads is now a record 12.8 years old and on track to tick over 13 years old this year. Because here's what the industry doesn't say out loud. People are holding on to their cars longer, largely because of new and used prices being brutal, which makes affordable, accessible repair less of an enthusiast's hobby and more of a household necessity, and locking it behind a dealer counter hits hardest exactly when people can afford it least. And in the EV world especially, where the ability to keep a car running long after it's rolled off the production line matters most, and where, let's remember, modern battery packs are increasingly outlasting the cars they're fitted to, being able to take your car to a third-party repair specialist or even work on it yourself is essential to keep those vehicles on the road long after the franchise dealerships have stopped paying attention. And we have data to back this up. Granted, it is anecdotal, but it is there. I have talked to multiple owners of original 2011 through 2015 vintage EVs whose local dealerships are reluctant or just downright refuse to work on them at all because in the eyes of the automaker they're effectively end of life. Sometimes these vehicles need nothing more than a simple maintenance routine, dropping the pack, replacing a desiccant pack, and then hitting a button in the service software to confirm the job's done, and yes, the Electric Smart, I am looking at you. A job that simply won't be possible in the future if right to repair is curtailed and automakers lose interest in serving said vehicles. Automakers who, in the age of President Trump, are walking back their EV pledges, cancelling models and telling customers with 3-year-old cars that the part they need is on a 6-month backorder. And yes, I know the Smart's desiccant replaced flag can be set if owners pull the car's battery management computer and then ship it off to one of a handful of third-party experts dotted around the world. But that's something we should be able to do in software with a simple diagnostics cable and a laptop. Before we end, I want to draw a clear line here because it really does matter. I want to be absolutely clear. There is a difference between an automotive brand, its CEO, its executive C-suite and its lawyers, and the people who actually designed and built the thing. I have had the true privilege of going on many a press event over the years, and I've had the privilege of talking to a massive bunch of engineers and insiders at automakers who love EVs and who love the idea that owners and enthusiasts will tinker and tweak their cars. They get genuinely excited when someone tells them they've figured out an unofficial mod or swapped something stock for a custom part. Based on the conversations I've had, off the record, these engineers are on our side for the most part, but they very often have their hands metaphorically tied because the companies they work for aren't. So, to the engineers watching who support right to repair, hi, I see you. You rock. Thank you. And on that topic, there are 2 more things I really need to discuss before we finish. The matter of security through obscurity and the claimed safety concerns about working on your own vehicle. Yeah, I know I could also talk at length about enshittification, about being able to work on your own vehicles you actually own, and the question of who owns your data if you can't easily access and modify it yourself. But I'm not going to. I'm just going to go with those 2 things. Security first. It's no secret that automakers aren't all that great at software or security. They've gone from needing to make sure can't be physically broken into and driven off, and the Kia boys showed exactly how unsuccessful they've been at that. By the way, check out the recent video on it by former NASA engineer Mark Rober. It's quite a good video. And as I've said before, by keeping APIs and third-party access alive, automakers even increase their security, not decrease it. Open source communities and third-party apps are a great way to expand the pen testing potential of a system. Locking everything down to sanctioned apps only encourages people to try to break in harder and then not to share the backdoors when they actually find them. And that's before we get to the "but telematics could let your car be driven remotely" claim. The only truly safe way to prevent that is to air-gap the vehicle. No remote access at all. But it is also on automakers to build separate, completely isolated systems that make that kind of interaction impossible in the first place. It almost feels as if they're looking to blame other people for their own poor engineering decisions. The safety concerns, the fear that an amateur wrench turner could break something, damage their car, make something go bang, crash the vehicle, or worse still, set it on fire? That's not new. For as long as cars have existed, there have been ways to make them do things they shouldn't and ways to make them do things you'd rather they didn't. You're just as likely to set an ICE car from 1965 on fire because you didn't properly tighten a fuel line as you are to set an EV on fire in 2026 because you shorted something in the high voltage circuit. The risks are different, the outcomes are similar, and both sets of risks have the same remedy: knowledge, good safety training, good tools, and safety protocols. And I think that is what really irks me, because for as long as EVs have been around, people have been tweaking and tinkering with them, upgrading them, converting ICE cars to EVs and hybrids to plug-in hybrids. And sometimes, yes, people make mistakes. As I did back in 2008 when my plug-in hybrid suffered a catastrophic battery fault caused, or at least made worse, by my own poor amateur engineering choices. But I learned from them, just as the EV folk who work on their own conversions and their own factory-built EVs generally learn from their mistakes, follow good principles, teach themselves the safety considerations, and do things sensibly. But of course, there'll always be the occasional fool who doesn't. Just as there will always be the occasional person who wrenches on their own car and forgets something important, like tightening the coil or checking that the starter motor is still attached. Two things I learned the hard way by failing to do with my classic cars. But my point. Information breeds safety. Information lets us make wiser choices, devise smarter repairs, and stay safer. Locking things behind closed doors does none of that. It only serves to make a few people wealthier, and the rest of us more reliant on automaker-sanctioned dealers. Dealers who'll tell you that your car is unrepairable, or hand you a massive bill for a part you can buy online for $5. I know which future I'd honestly rather have. That's it for today's video, and if you made it this far, thank you. What do you think the future of right to repair looks like? And do you reckon the automakers will win in their push to keep repairs locked to dealerships? Let me know in the down below. Oh, and if you did make it this far, because I genuinely want to know you watched to the end, do you repair your EV yourself, take it to the dealer you purchased it from, or go to a specialist indie garage? Let me know in the comments. We are 100% independent, and if you'd like to help us stay that way, you can do so by following a link in the show notes where you can support us on Patreon from just $1.50 a month. And in doing so, you would join the long list of people scrolling by right now. You can also support us on Ko-fi, grab some swag from the store, and please hit subscribe. YouTube won't reliably tell you when we post, so follow us on social media or join us in our Discord or Fluxer chat rooms where I promise no one is trying to get you to pay through the nose for regular EV maintenance. Thank you for being the positive change we need in the world. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep evolving!